Hello, and welcome back to The Value of Everything. Now, we are going to walk into the land of controversy, the land of potential conspiracy theory. Oh, what the hell is that noise? Okay, my door was open. Right, so this is going to be quite a interesting discussion, which we're going to approach here, or this monologue is going to be an interesting one, whereby I'll try and approach all of these pretty much important questions that we need to ask about potentially our future, and try and give a fairly balanced view, and I'll try and do it from both sides of the angle. I will state my position. Firstly, I am a libertarian, so I believe in freedom, and I believe in the prosperity of people. It is in the hands of ourselves, not in other people. Also, I believe that we potentially could find ourselves in a better world where we reduce the size of government to such a very, very small position until we almost find that there is like applications and things that we can pretty much not have any requirement for a government in the future, because services are provided for by private entities instead of government entities. So that is my standpoint. I believe that well, it's not a belief on a moral subject ground. Where you have governance, you do have the use of force, which can be put onto people at any stage to require anything, which is potentially a dangerous thing. I guess when it's like a reasonable tax level, then most people do not mind. However, obviously some people do mind, but we do have concerns when maybe not this government, but another government comes into power. We do potentially have the retractment of people's civil liberties. So that's just generally where I stand. So this is going to potentially be a little bit biased, but I will try and give a fair and balanced view. I will try and be pro-world government at the same time of being as pointing to and highlighting moral and effective arguments on the point of a single world government. So, what is one of the major purposes of a world government? Or let's go through a few of the purposes of a world government. A world government potentially has the ability to stop world war. Now, it doesn't really seem that relevant today because world war doesn't really happen that much. It's pretty much outside of the memory of the general populace. People that may be born in the 1930s can really remember world wars, but beyond that, you really got a few people that have gone through wars or been brought up in a warring state. I guess you have had migration from Iraq and places like that, but really the wars have been occurring with like the Western countries and their states themselves. So it's an interesting perspective. So an eradication of war would be an amazing bonus. We seem to have a state of not much world war anymore, and we have little battles which occur in foreign lands for pretty much money. And since the invention of the nuclear or the atomic weapons, people have refrained quite massively into escalating any kind of violence between one nation to another, particularly any sort of advanced nation. So we're pretty much you could say we're pretty cool at the moment. I guess we haven't had a big shake-up in terms of our economy, whereas like in the 1930s, obviously that was a precursor of the Second World War because of the Great Depression, a number of factors which put the economies into an absolute state of decay and deprivation, and certain trades and embargoes which got put forward for certain protectionisms, gave the uprisings of very extremist parties. So you do potentially have that, and maybe we do have that around the corner, but even so, for the meantime, we don't really seem to have much of a purpose for a one world government to abolish the state of war. A next question would be, obviously, you do have like a traditional war between one nation state to another nation state may not be probable, but I don't believe that having a one world government would really eradicate the act of terrorism. So terrorism is pretty much a warfare which is done on a sort of a guerrilla level. So once you move all the power into one big hand, you pretty much put a big target on your head. It can be fairly dangerous for just some general office workers to be working for this one world government. And people that have very extremist views on the one world government can potentially target you for these things. And it is obviously it's an act of potential violence or things which are coming on like that. Now it's interesting in terms of how, if there was a one world government in place, how this would be perceived. Obviously, it would be perceived as an act of terrorism. However, with the terms of an act of terrorism, you potentially do require more information to hunt down terrorists as a whole. There isn't actually a nation state which groups up these people. These people might be religiously inclined. These people might be fundamentally sort of like they have their own nation state and they require this nation. They may be obviously just general people that don't want to have a singular world government governing over them. There's all these different types of factors which could occur in the state of a singular one world government. So it's interesting in those terms. If you claim that a one world government would bring us to a state of peace, in some ways there's very big counter arguments to suggest otherwise. As you can see, America being a superpower and potentially a superpower in decline because of the amount of national debt that has occurred, like the Roman Empire, has gone to fight these massive wars with a ridiculous amount of technology and equipment and manpower and big budget spendings, which are obviously in deficit spendings. And then they find themselves drawing to their knees because of the amount of expense that this super-sized government has to go under to hunt down a few terrorists, maybe that want to plant a bomb or something like that. So you're looking at potentially, from just a budgetary perspective, you're looking at having a massive department of terrorism defense just to combat against a few people which want to potentially overthrow the state of a one world government. So just arguing in terms of just budget and expense and effectiveness, we just do have some very large issues that we're throwing up in those terms. So yeah, that's some good arguments. Definitely, if there's I'd love to hear anybody for and against putting forward arguments. Even if that's not necessarily your view, that you do believe in a one world government, please put forward like a one world government argument for, and potentially a one more world argument against, both into any comment sections, and then obviously we can just both deduce what may be valid and invalid. Okay, so yeah, we've this is the arguments of future threat of wars. We have, which is I think one of the major points that from a one world government perspective, again, is the effectiveness of looking after the world. So I guess we could say that we as people, as a populace of people, we are doing our day-to-day activities, we are breeding, we are getting larger and larger in size, but we've got no real oversight of what we are doing to the planet and what we are doing in terms of pollution, how we are really going way, way beyond the support systems of this planet. And when you look up the words of extinction, extinction does occur when an animal, or just basically like an environmental factor of where the population gets too out of control with the environment and the sustainability of the environment, then then all resources just get completely depleted, and then you do have this massive churn over, a lot of deaths of that species until some retrenchment of stability happens again. So yeah, we don't really want to get too carried away in terms of going way beyond our means in terms of how much this planet can support. So a one world government may be a potential answer because there's too much bureaucracy between one country and the other. One country might be a highly sophisticated Western country, whereas another country could be a third world country. And whereas different countries have different economic goals and different priorities in terms of what the people vote for, you get this scenario where potentially the lower, the less wealthy country will say, well, we can't afford to be as environmentally friendly as you. We need to catch up. You've probably done a lot of polluting in the past, and we just need to do all that polluting just get to the state of a Western country. So, sorry, we can't carry on and implement this environmental idea with you. So here comes the one world government to say, no, we need to be under one structure to say, right, this one world government will remedy these problems, the environment, and should improve the standards and the quality and the sustainability of the people. Now, I think this is probably one of the most compelling arguments. I think one of a quick counter argument for this is that it's a little bit tricky in terms of how it's implemented. So one of the ways that has been suggested is carbon credits. Now, carbon credits in itself, what is plants' favourite food? It is carbon itself, so to restrict carbon emissions can be a little bit, not sure here. We do have, we originally thought it was global warming, now we potentially have climate change, which the climate, the weather does just change anyway, so if you do see a lot of variance in the weather systems, I think there's pretty much a bit of a standard correlation which has occurred. When we're looking at climates, we're just purely looking at humans' effects, but we're not looking at much other effects, potentially looking at whether the sun goes through different phases of heat and giving out certain solar flares, which can change the weather patterns. Obviously, that's the source of where we get all our heat and everything else. If that changes, then obviously that has a direct correlation effect on us, where we are spinning around in the solar system, all these number of factors outside of where we are, compared to just looking purely upon our emissions. So there is a lot of nuances which are occurring here in terms of how we deploy a really correct scheme of protecting our environment to a sustainable level. Here comes the budgetary costs element of this. Now, if I did say, right, okay, well, this one world government is in place, you could only imagine the expense that would be required to have this humongous department of the environment to be working on statistical data and trying to work out the best means to have a global sustainable model of the nation. Now, we're obviously potentially looking at the acts also of saying that one person may not be allowed to have any more than 2 children or 1 children to have a sustainable level of the environment to the globe. But then once we go down the route of central planning, we may not know of certain things which could be occurring. So we may find that we can produce abundances of crops with certain amounts of scientific discoveries, and the sustainability of the planet can rapidly grow up far beyond what we have right now. There could be like side-by-side cities everywhere you look. We may have different ways of harnessing energy. There's all different things that could potentially occur that if we are centrally planning things and we wasn't really prepared for something, then the centrally planned ideal may look kind of silly and a little bit unsure. Now, I'd like to just mention a few little bit of things about central planning. If you look at China right now, it's potentially going under a few issues with its own central planning. So I think most people are aware of the one-child policy for China, and that is demographically a little bit of an issue for them in the economy. Now the economy is starting to go a little bit south, and they really have a slightly more of an aging population than a growing population. There is less demand domestically, and they have to put in certain levels of stimulus to sustain the model and reduce the cost of their Chinese yuan to increase the amount of demand for exports. Japan has been going under this population decline, and that has had tremendous levels of problems for the economy there. This is obviously to do with how a credit-based economy is working. So obviously these countries around the world require a consistent level of credit expansion to improve their states. But just in this example, obviously with China, now they're having some problems with the central planning that they put in place, which was for good reasons, to have a stable model for communism. Now they come to terms of capitalism, and they're thinking, maybe it was a little bit of a tricky idea for having an aging population now. Also, central planning has made... Oh, I've got a little bit of traffic here. Has given China some potential issues now with a massive spending. So obviously they had issues with their economy, so they had to put in certain stimuluses, and one of those were to put in a very large stimulus package to build infrastructure and massive housing building plans throughout the country to build up the populous cities and departments and everything else, but everything has been done on pure credit expansion, and really there isn't a sustainable model of all of this credit expansion. So you can see how very clever people, probably for the Chinese state, have been trying to centrally plan certain ideas and ideals and models, and still the ability for the states to actually master them is really getting scuppered. Now, this comes to a very important thing for a government, which is money. Now, an environment thing, people seem to get away with environment catastrophes a little bit easier because lakes can be polluted, but yet people can seem to get away with it because it's only a lake. There's only a certain few animals which are getting killed off in there, but as long as it's not a direct effect on humans, then it's okay. If you look at China with the massive amount of smog and smog clouds which happen and occur in the country, they're trying to combat against it in terms of what they're trying to do originally, which was to expand the manufacturing sector of China. Now they're finding that they've got a major problem with the environment. So obviously I'm using different areas for explaining how central planning can be affected, but these rules still apply when it comes to central planning for the environment. So if the government does come into power, if a world government comes into power and it says, okay, well, we're going to find this way of combating the environment, maybe it's a restriction of population, maybe it's a restriction on the amount of pollution which is occurring, or an increase of recycling. It's there's potential ways that different people will start to find ways to get around systems and everything else. So really, the power of environments does happen in the hands of people. It does sound quite dreamy in the way of me mentioning that, but if I give you the idea that if we have this piece of land that like 5 people in the street all owned, how well do you think that piece of land would be maintained if there wasn't really much of an order between all of us or anything like that? We would just literally and let that piece of land just overgrow, and we wouldn't really care too much of it because we would expect the other person to care for it themselves. So it would just get overrun and to a state of that, and that is a joint communal piece of land. Now, if we had private ownership of this land, so I claim that this land is mine, then I would have definitely an idea to keep it better maintained, particularly if I wanted to use it for a productive measure or if I wanted to sell it on to another person. I would definitely keep that piece of land to a higher state of quality. Now, as you can see, the government does own a lot of resources and land. Now, the government does also own airspace and seas and items like that, which doesn't really come onto the private market. But if you could, I could like put you into an imagination point of saying this, all of these items were available to you, and you could purchase airspace for planes and pollution and things like that, and you could own seas. If you own the airspace, then potentially you could measure the quality of pollution, and then you could go over to certain factories and go, look, you are polluting my air by this amount. Because you're using my airspace, I will request that you pay me this amount. You will not be able to use this any further. So there is a certain level of a profit motive involved in this. And then if there is people that are being allowed to pollute into that airspace, then you may well have people that live in that airspace as well. And they say, well, if you're going to pollute into this area and allow these factories to pollute so much, then I will choose to move out of there and I will not pay you any charges to use the airspace. It does sound quite strange how people are charging for air, but if you can determine that there is a private ownership matter which is going on, you could own certain segments and we could convert this all onto a ledger which is decentralized like the blockchain. Then we do have this certain terms of private ownership, and people will try and provide the best quality for people to use. And generally throughout the lands, the seas, the airs, we will have with private ownership a better use and a more sustainable use of quality. So interesting factors. I don't think you can get rid of somebody just owning the world, because that wouldn't really work out too well. But in terms of just having private ownership of land and air and seas and different items like that, then we do have a much better quality insurance which occurs in terms of all of those items. It's one of those tricky arguments in terms of where you do see that there has been government drivers to increase recycling and things like that. And you do see that Western countries in general seem to be a little bit cleaner than it does to industrial countries or third world countries. So there is definitely an argument in terms of, well, looks like a much more of a sustainable model for protecting our environment. But if we did have a model of decentralized private ownership of resources, then you would definitely see an improvement of the quality of how things were run. Now, if you look at roads, if you see a private road, I know obviously if you just see a private road just leading to a house, it can be a bit shit. But say if you go to Disney's parks, you can see this massive motorway just built purely for Disney. That quality of the motorway is generally quite nice compared to the non-private versions. So you do definitely have certain standards which get maintained and upheld when things are privately owned. Now, people say, okay, well, what about if everyone owns stuff, everyone's going to try and turn everything into a factory, or everyone thinks it's going to turn it into pavement, and not really look on a whole level of what's happening to the environment, well, there will be a certain counteracting part. If people are dilapidating the environment and people have a respect of value of things, people will start to say, I really value having land which has trees in it and all of those items. So potentially people would take ownership and really plant trees in terms of their own requirements of having trees because they value them more so than anybody else. Now, you potentially could say, well, but people might be just really chasing after the value of things, but I do believe that we should be going towards a model of sustainability and a view of exchanging value for value rather than just trying to greed upon money for money's sake. So you may find yourself into a place of being very wealthy, then you may want to purchase large allotments of land which you can maintain in a very wildlife sort of state, and you potentially could charge people just to use a load of these little lands. You can set up your own business where people can charge you an annual fee, and you can maintain and ensure that the sustainability of the wildlife and the woodlands is very good for everyone else. So that's just certain arguments. It is one of the hardest ones to get probably your head around, and that's why I believe that governments will try and adopt climate change as one of their methods of implementing a beautiful one world government. Let's move into another one. So, disasters. Now, you would expect, okay, yeah, this is an important one. If you had a disaster, I have covered a lot of these points in a previous podcast with regards of central planning, but even so, I'd like to just cover these points because it is interesting where you try and get counter arguments for a one world government. Say if there was let's go for the traditional disaster of which everyone fears, a meteorite which is going to hit the Earth and decimate the species, like the dinosaurs or the humans, and we are going to get wiped out, and we just end up being a part of a natural history museum. So, what could happen if we were all just privateers that were walking around with all our private lands and stuff like that, and this meteor is coming, and then we're like, we actually haven't got much of a military here, have we? This is a bit of a shocker. We're all just these little private business-running people with no real defense mechanism which is in place. So what can we do? And then by the time we would even be able to set up like a spud gun or anything like that to put down the meteorites, we will be wiped out. So let's say, for example, that there is insurance. And one thing that people would value quite importantly would be an insurance policy for natural disasters. And with natural disasters, prevention is much more important than cure. There would be definite different ratings of natural disasters compared to one to the other. So if there were to be a natural disaster where a meteorite of a certain level or size was going to wipe out a city, that would be an incredible expense to an insurance company. So, now it does sound kind of funny having your insurance company owning missiles, but if you did have an insurance company that did have a cost-based view of how much the meteorite would cost and could blow up the world, you potentially would have a pricing mechanism which would be put in place to say, okay, well, it's going to cost us this much to have military, some kind of option to stop a meteorite from hitting us. We would have to have certain satellites which would scan the globe. We would have to have a certain type of sophisticated missile which could go spaceborne and strike the meteor from outer space. This potentially is quite expensive, but if there was a collaboration of insurance companies and the costs can be mitigated by a certain level and expense, you will find that The idea wouldn't be too out of the ordinary. I guess missiles obviously have been discovered. It's not like it's a totally new thing that needs to be invented here. And yeah, you will have a coordinated missile defense system around the world by literally insurance companies. Now, hopefully, obviously, you don't have some mad person who's in charge of this insurance company, and there will probably be some sort of global code system that if it was recognized and the scientists did agree that this was happening, then yes, this would happen, and you could launch the missiles to destroy the meteorites. So that sort of gives you a little bit of an inkling in terms of how that would happen. Obviously, if you had a one world government, you do have certain militaries and things like that on standby. But then, obviously, in terms of a world government is using things, might be using things in terms of less so in insurance terms and price adjustment things, and more so in its ideologies. So there might not necessarily be this privateer ideal of how much things could be expensed, how much things could be a danger to us, and insurance companies can work out a private ratio of how much things could cost. Whereas with a world government, you potentially have people that are in power which want to put in things which are ideologically inclined. So where it comes to budget requirements, maybe they say, okay, well, we want to find a cure for cancer now, and all the ideas and the biggest brains might be focused upon one area, which will be the scientific discovery of finding out a cure for cancer, whereby a meteor is on its way and could decimate us at the same time. So if we was all privatized and we was all into our own self-interest and looking upon lots of things, there would be definite pricing signals as to the implementation of the act of a missile defense system for meteor strikes, and also there will be a certain pricing reward structure for the discovery of cancer. So it does occur, and we don't necessarily, there isn't really sort of the best argument to say that we do need a central power to orchestrate the defense of the nation. Now, I've gone into more of a detailed sort of view of ambulances, and I have gone into a detailed view of police forces as well. Just run through a few of my podcasts of the past. I've done Healthcare in Anarchy beforehand, which does go into the healthcare systems with regards to police forces. You potentially, with the eradication of governance and certain ideological pointers, so like the war on drugs, you do massively reduce the requirement and the size of the state. If you obviously reduce the target which is put upon you, if you do create this humongous one world government, there's even less of a requirement for security forces. So we are really rapidly reducing the requirements, and there's a massive cost benefit of having a ridiculous amount of security. Now, security does freeform itself in it anyway. Say if you did have a large chain of a party district, they do provide their own security for their areas. Now, people could privately own those streets as well, so there could be a collaboration of people that are providing security for the areas. There are certain things like mobile phone apps where people could say if there were any kind of trouble, they could click a button on a phone app, and that could signal that people are in threat of danger, and could, if you have adequate insurance, but obviously you could have just general charity, and people could just raise an alarm to say, help, I need somebody's help, and there'll be like a little alarm system which goes onto everybody else's phone saying that somebody requires help. People could just on a humanitarian basis just run to their aid. So people would be self-empowered in terms of pardon me, my throat's going a bit. People will be self-empowered in terms of how they can securitize and help each other out. In some ways, in my little opinion, I do find it a little bit worrying sometimes where they say, if you see a violent act, do not act at all. You walk away and you phone the police, but it sometimes is responsibility of the village to raise a child, and it's the responsibility of the village to look after each other. So it would be kind of nice that there would be some kind of rule of morality which was applied to everybody, so people were quite aware of moral stances and things like that. So you can have afford yourself a certain level of security, which would be ridiculously cheaper than in comparisons to having a one world military or counter-terrorism state or department, as well as a one world government police force as well to police the streets and carry out the past laws of any central planning ideas. Potentially, this might be also because you're having this problem of you might have a problem of terrorism on the one world government. You also potentially have the implementation of civil liberties, which could be removed from from people in terms of having this one world government at the same time. So this leads me to another little area, which is kind of interesting. Sorry, my voice is breaking a bit here. We do have a fairly decent argument here. Obviously, if the let me just get some water because my voice is breaking. Too much of me screaming freedom before I started this podcast. Anyway, so a one world government potentially has the idea of saying, well, passports and border controls will no longer be really required because everybody would be a citizen of the nation. So that could be a potential bonus of having no passports, but I very much would doubt it in those terms because you'd still have the problem of terrorism. So you don't have the problem of terrorism when you have individuals who are privateers. You obviously have potential conflicts and disputes over land and things like that, but you're not going to have this major terrorist organization which is going to go around bombing places because of just small little disputes over private landowners. So the interesting part is you'd think, okay, maybe it will be much easier having a one world government and to pass borders, but still you would require the purpose of security, border controls, in terms of passports and to transfer from one place to the other. Potentially, say if we did live in a land where everyone was voluntary privateers going around and trading value for value, potentially there could be some crazed mad person that really wanted a one world government, and he was in the mindset of bombing aeroplanes and things like that. Yeah, you might still require a certain amount of security measures and things about to prevent people from endangering the lives of others. But beyond that, we do have a fairly decent argument in terms of civil liberties where it comes to being a voluntary privateer sort of based country compared to a one world state. Now, yeah, so I've sort of covered a little bit of centralization and how it can seem for first glance, it can seem to be quite a decent idea. If you like, you try and approach it and go, oh, okay, what are these one world governments? What are these Rockefellers trying to talk about? It does sound at first, this does kind of sound like a nice, like not a bad idea. It sounds pretty structurally sound, but once you dig a little bit deeper, it does raise certain issues. If you could think in terms of a business world, you have throughout history numbers of businesses that have come into power and management, and they have just been specifically trying to design maybe one product or a few products. And look at all the businesses that have failed. There has been a ridiculous amount of businesses which have failed just to supply a product to one of its target audiences and to make a decent profit. So a profit would just be it could still just be on a non-profit basis and just survive on its basis there. But even just to make a tiny profit and just have that business running over and redesigning and still producing a good thing and getting the budget working, not many businesses survive. If you look at the history of businesses, and this is just a private thing where really there's no moral, ethical codes which are being broken here. A business is just trying to design something, say like a Kodak photo, and it's trying to provide a centrally planned, in terms of its management structure, a product to its customer. And yet there is a significant amount of failures of businesses which do occur anyway. So it does lead to the question why you would require this humongous one world government where potentially it does have the potential to distort things and everything else. Now, one of the problems is that you have, when you have a one world government, you have the problem of economics as well. And where you have money into the equation, you do have significant issues, because there is the ability to distort the environment to obviously advantage your friends and families or your sexual partners, just so that you can pass certain laws and embargoes and trades, or centrally manage things just to advantage one person to the other. So, in terms of the central one world government, the tricky one would be obviously a central bank. So a central bank would have the ability to control the money supply which comes into the market. And therefore, we have the thing of inflation, which is an increase of the money supply, and then deflation, which is a retractment of the money supply. Maybe, but money supply can be coordinated by just expansion of loans and things like that. So, with a one world government, we come into the and a one world central banking system. We come down into the world of ideologies, which is really problematic. Let me get a little bit more water. Oh, my throat. I should gargle some brandy before I start, but probably not while I drive. Anyway. So, where was my trail of thought? So, I was talking about, central banking. Now, where we come to central banking, there is an ideological sort of perspective which comes into place. I don't know really what a one world government would decide to do, but a one world government, obviously, it could stick to the normal Western sort of ways of continuous credit expansion. So the one world government can continuously promise loads of stuff in the future and come to power, and political parties, say if the one world government was based on democracies and certain parties could come into power and all that kind of stuff. There's lots of questions that get raised on that point as well. But if you do have these political motives which get in charge and has the ability to control money supply, then you do have things that you could rapidly distort the way that the environment works. So if you want to have this credit expansion, ideological perspective of banking, you would continuously increase the money supply so that you would have a populace thinking that their money is worth a lot less in the future because of inflation. So the prices of goods become a lot cheaper. Prices of goods become, in general, more expensive. I know technology usually gets a bit cheaper over time, but everything else becomes more expensive, so it's better to spend the money in the now, becoming very instant gratification-like, and going to the shops and going onto a spending frenzy. So the economy can keep on rolling, and you can set up a business, and people are quite free to spend their money, and they don't give two shits about spending money here and there. So you create this mindset of the people and the populace. You potentially have people thinking that there's no purpose of repairing anything because repairing anything costs too much money. So you do have this rapid distortion of the market if you just have a credit expansionist perspective. Now, you could have like this non-credit expansionist viewpoint and keep in a very balanced book, and that can rapidly retrench the spending, and that potentially does have important improvements in terms of sustainability of the environment. Maybe if the government did really wanted to have a very sustainable environment, they would stop the increase of credit supply. And this is happening obviously at a global level with quantitative easing and everything else. But we could have a really sustainable driver which gets put in place. So really, obviously, if you did have a one world government, you really don't. You would say, let's not have any central banking system, and we're just going to have these credits which are going to remain static, and people just need to transfer value from one side to the other. And because the one world government declares this as legal tender, we are not going to start to hijack this monetary supply, and we're not going to start saying this is worth more or less to manipulate the markets. Maybe potentially you could have something that's okay there, but where there's power and where there's the money and everything else, which really boils down to people's greed, you're going to really get this ideological people which are going to come into power at some point and say, maybe we need to go back to the eras of central banking and increasing and manipulating the money supply. So yeah, we do have issues in terms of central banking. Now, obviously, where we have central banking around the world, that does... I'm not saying that central banking around the world is a perfect system in itself. Obviously, they are still centrally planning economies, and you can see how things are going right now. And then in the 1930s, things do get massively distorted. They try and do counterbalances, counteractions. So where you would expect that if there was a massive asset bubble in the housing market, you would expect interest rates to rise to counteract that, but that hadn't been happening. So the effectiveness of central banking doesn't necessarily work too well. You would surely have had a rapid increase of interest rates during the turn of the millennium because of the credit expansion which was occurring, but that didn't happen, and we find ourselves in worse and worse positions as time goes on. So, here I just covered a lot of little areas of one world governments and pros and cons and different issues that which do occur. And it does really come down to the central management thing again. And I've tried to make a fairly decent amount of counter arguments when it comes to central planning and central management. And I think that they're pretty watertight, but obviously if you can find any holes, please fire out some comments and suggestions. Just to make some examples, there are obviously an amalgamation of nation states around the world. There's the Arab League, there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there's the African Union, NATO. Obviously, NATO's a more of a defense league of military resources of Western countries. You do have, which Putin doesn't like, and you have governing bodies of sport, so the soccer or your football, which is like FIFA, is controlled by central powers. Now, obviously, you can see in those terms how that central authority doesn't seem to be of too much of a good standing. They seem to be fairly corrupt, and they seem to be getting a lot of backhanders, favors for favors, and there's a lot of money being thrown into the system. And obviously, where you have a central combined power which has the ability to pass laws in favor of one market to another, you have a lot of people that are going to get very close to that and obviously lobby and provide money and do backhanders and have very good negotiators. So you do have a lot of corruption, maybe provide prostitutes, all of that kind of shenanigans. Whatever a man or a woman wants, there will be all these things that will be provided, maybe shopping sprees, whatever. Where it comes to the element of power, there will be lots of freebies and sweeties that will be provided to you so that you can make a biased stance on the law and to favour one side to the other. Now, in terms of a central one world government, you could only imagine, because we could also expect that there may be corporations around as well, you could only imagine the amount of money that would be paid in terms of corrupting the politicians that were working at the top of the one world government. In fact, it would be ridiculous because everybody would be, the major companies of the world would be supplying those people at the top of the state. And then you have this really ridiculous situation where you have major multinational companies which would have incredible amounts of money because of the way that the political and the law system is structured to protect their companies, would be in power. So it would make them hyper sort of a big cash cow, and they wouldn't have to be competitive or anything like that. So they would basically be really stuck in the same time. Say if they're a car manufacturer, the car would just pretty much stay the same. Maybe there would just be two car manufacturers, and there would literally just be no design or innovation or competition which would be occurring. It would just be them being very nice and cozy to the powers at the top of the government. So this also applies to healthcare, any number of business sectors. You would have this incredible amount of massive, supersized companies being very close and chummy to the central planners and how the economy would be working. This is obviously just the states that we're living in right now, where we have a corporatocracy, where corporates are really paying the monies to the political parties so that they can get certain things that are awarded to them in terms of political legislations to help them out. But imagine that on a much more of an extreme scale. We would all be working just for a certain handful of companies. The level of production and quality and real capitalism and privatism would be really reduced. There'll be a ridiculous amount of things that we would have to do. So you get sort of the things, say, if you wanted to sell sandwiches, that would be a ridiculous amount of licensing that would be required. That it's not really much point getting involved. Say if you wanted to have your son or daughter to have a little lemon stand outside your house, that there would be no way that could be granted because of the amount of legislation that was put in granted for the big corporations. So you would find this ever-increasing nanny state which would occur before our eyes. Whether we would like it or not, this is just the way that the power structure works. So in a privateer sense, this is all handled in its own level, and people can obviously freely trade as much as they want. Obviously, if you may have somebody that's selling dodgy goods, but you can have mobile phone apps which rate the health quality of all the restaurants that you can frequent to. I thought of the other day where you could have Google Glasses looking around what's the best restaurants. You can get highly rate, and you look around on a shopping street and you can see ones which have got good reviews and bad reviews, and also there's like the an independent health inspector which gives its reviews as well. And you look with these Google Glasses down the street, and you can go into any sort of restaurant as you choose, and it's all privately owned and independent, and everyone's got their own creativity and designs behind it. If we go into this one world government, we are lending ourselves to this big McDonald's world where everything becomes the same and there isn't much variety and choice and spice of life. So that again is the slight counter argument to one world government. And I do like variety. Variety is lovely. And I do like independent stores. I do like speaking to individual people that do own their companies. It is kind of interesting speaking to those people compared to just this massive multinational corporation where there's this person there who doesn't really care or know anything about the company, just be talking back to you and really doesn't know much about the product, and yeah, all those kind of factors. You can expect a lot more of the same when it comes to a one world government state. So yeah, it's interesting, very interesting in lots of things, and yeah, where we start to remove, we disempower people, and things come out of their hands, and the creativity comes out of their hands, and they become more futile and pointless, and you get all these youths coming out of colleges with qualifications, really just maybe to start on to work with another corporation, but really there's sort of like this thing where they're thinking to themselves, I had all these ideas and creative talents and powers, and not powers, but just creative ideas and this enthusiasm, and now it's just been evaporated in terms of all of this stuff because of this state of governance that we're under. So yeah, I have covered a number of areas. Now, I'd like to just mention on an area. So, if you could think of a freer nation in the past, we were a freer nation, individual countries. We were a lot freer in the past, I believe. You may be able to counter-argument with me against this. I guess there's less warfare and things like that, but there has been a gradual implementation of more so a combining of states. I guess we are seeing problems in the Eurozone and things like that, how you can't necessarily have central planning on monetary levels where people can still play around with their budgets and still be awarded with the same amount of interest for issuing its bonds. So, for interest on its debt with the Eurozone. So it is... there are a lot of warning signs. No, so globalisation, is an interesting phenomenon. I would like to just add that one into the mix because globalisation is intertwined with one world government in itself. Because now we live in countries where everybody from pretty much where you get a major country, say like from the USA. I'm sure that pretty much, other than extremely tiny countries, you've probably got everyone in the world who's been from anywhere in the world living in America, living in London. Like, these major cities are obviously populated with everybody from everywhere around the world. So we do have a certain sense of globalization which does occur. And you could say, yeah, okay, that is maybe a little bit more of a gradual implementation, in fact, of how the state could be run. And it does seem like, oh yeah, globalization, it isn't too much of a big deal. We all seem to be getting along pretty well. And yeah, okay, that you could put forward those arguments. I think it's a good thing, really, how cultures have been intermixed now, because there's less nationalism, which has been a big emphasis in the past. So where we could divide people from saying, okay, we're one certain sect or race or religion, now there's so much of a distortion of everybody being all into this one mix that it's very hard to really isolate us from one to another. And we are really just like a one world populace of people. So regardless of whether it's happened or not, I don't think really the government does like a ridiculous amount of free movement of the world. But as globalization has happened, we have sort of slightly nullified the effect of patriotism and nationalism. So that's a really good thing, I think, in some ways. I don't think... I'm not sure exactly how implementation of border controls would happen under one world states. Governments, if you look at immigration policies at the moment, they do seem to use immigration policies just to further certain political persuasions or causes. So if they're a very left-wing party, maybe they may request more people in from countries which are that way inclined. But really, they just really want to get these high-caliber, high-earning workers, which they do as well, or these people that have a lot of equities. A lot of the Western countries do that now anyway. But you will potentially have, in a one world government, you may have the freedom of movement more so of the rich and the high classes and less so of the lower classes and things like that. So just, I think, purely on a monetary level, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure even where I'm coming with this point, and I don't think it really makes too much of a relevance of one world government. But where it comes to the implementation of one world government, I'm just making the comparative point that things have gradually changed, and we do almost look like we're becoming part of a one world government in terms that we're all nationally mixed in terms of where we are from. So if there was meant to be a implementation of a one world government, there was some kind of secrecy thing that was going on in the background. the ease of that happening is probably quite easy now because we're all quite mixed up in our little pools of people. But I think there has been sort of some information to say that where people from different countries go, especially of different languages, they seem to create their own little groupings of people, and they don't really mix around too much. So that can be a little bit problematic. So let's go through a few more of my notes. Yeah, so I think in general, where you look at a lot of things, especially like where it comes to surveillance, we do seem to be more surveyed. There is central authorities of, say, search engines and things like that, which are coming into power, and it's a little bit it does seem to be a little bit Orwellian and 1984, but in another way, it does the way that, obviously, I've mentioned this in a podcast before about Huxley's divergence and different sort of compartmentalizations of people. It does seem a little bit different as well. So, I guess if you're listening to me right now, you're probably part of a little bit more of an open-mindedness, a little bit more of a philosophic viewpoint. So you're part of the philosophy club of people, of free thinkers, and maybe libertarians, whereby if you really liked those Japanese kitties, you could join your own little club. If you liked the goth movement, you can all join your own little clubs and sector off into your own little way and state of form. So I do think that as time has progressed, I think everyone's starting to become a little bit more compartmentalized. I think music genres really, there used to be a one single medium of music. Now it's just literally gone every single area possible known to man. And really, I think sometimes it's a little bit hard to have that Michael Jackson or that Elvis Presley becoming that phenomenal figure anymore, because there's so many different little movements and classes which are occurring, that a structurally one world government is going to be a little bit tricky to implement. So that's just one little pointer that I'd like to make in those terms. Also, we've got to think of, unless if we just go down the route of Huxley anyway, we've got to think about how governments and power could come together without us really knowing. So there could be this quiet, and I mentioned this beforehand about gradualization, that we could have so many distractions where we do our own thing and we all sect off into our own little play groups and everything else, and how we just like to have instant gratification all the time, that we may have central authorities on governance of the internet, on the governance of virtual reality, of the governance of the environment, and we really are just distracted by mass media, and we don't read books or don't read articles which get released, and slowly there becomes a centralized force which comes into power, which may have very nice friendly motives, but then we do not know what government could come afterwards that may be able to use it for ill means. So there is always that concern, and whereby we are this globalized, very mixed population of people, and we're all channeling off into our own little sex, I guess. Sex, not sex. I guess, what's the word? We're just, we're really, we're mastering in a global level our own distractions. So we're all distracted on a globalization level into our own little sects, that we cannot really foresee this implementation of a one world governance. Now, you would hope that as we go into our own little sects, that we would potentially have more of a motivation to be privateers and seeking our own self-empowerment, our own self-improvement, our progression as people, so we could further our causes. But we do obviously have to concern ourselves with these things. Now, remember where it comes to where we live in today's era. Just I think we're probably maybe a little bit on the tail end of this, but where we have a fairly stable economy and things run, and we can get jobs and everything else. Government becomes a little less relevant because things are going pretty rosy. We don't really see the government as being this big power or this force which implements tax schemes on us or anything like that. So I guess we do have a little moan and things like that. Oh no, they're moaning, they're raising tax levies on this. Oh, they always get out of this, all this kind of stuff. But we don't see many issues in terms of governments in that respect. But where there is economies which start to crash and fail, and this is obviously one of the concern points where it comes to world governments, is that where there is a major crash and there's economic failures and nation states really try and increase the money supply to resolve mass deflation, which they pretty much is just basically the market trying to find price discovery, then they find themselves into a hyperinflation state, and the government becomes the government's legitimacy becomes in question because of its inability to afford police, military, border controls, and it's even to implement its taxation system, which pretty much nullifies the government in itself. Therefore, you would have the abolishment of welfare systems, and then you would have at that point this humongous cry out for, oh my God, what is going to happen now? We do not have any of these things in place. People are starving on the streets. We do have these massive struggles. And the question would be at that point that the solution comes across. So people come across and they go, hey, we've got the idea. We know how to resolve this problem of governance. We can create one supersized giant world government which can instantly resolve our problems in this 1 second of time. So now we've got people starving right now, and where people's minds are phased with the mass starvation and things like that, people could say, okay, well, rather than going into this privateer world where we have this mercantilism which comes into place, and people that have land and maybe bitcoins and things like that, or gold, they come into power, and well, not power, but they have sufficient means to improve and progress mankind. We won't look at that, and we'll look in terms of putting in place a one world government. And maybe they might say to themselves, okay, well, also what we need to do is obviously this Bitcoin thing is really quite kind of dangerous because people are really having a lot more power. They can obviously afford military force and power and guns and things like that. And we can't allow this into these dangerous people. And what we have to do now is we have to put in place a one singular world government who can really feed the poor and provide goods and services to people, and really improve the general being of the globe and be in control of populations and environment, and really resolve all the world's ills. This is probably the solution that is going to be for the meantime. But as I hope libertarians and people that love freedom and civil liberty and love the empowerment of people and our freedoms throughout time and history, there has been a hefty amount of suppression on mankind where it comes to religion. Everybody used to put all their money into the local churches, and they would be a charity of themselves, and everyone wouldn't be able to speak a word against God and things like that. As time has progressed, as people have been able to create more, obviously you can see that there's been a historical change over time whereby mankind has had more civil liberties and capitalism has been able to flourish, and so a beautiful amount of things have been able to be produced. However, there has been this continuous story of man and its struggle with the terms of power and governance and how it has been managed. And if you look at this historical situation between man and power, there has been beautiful things where we take an approach of civil liberty in comparison to an approach to consolidations of power structures. So Yeah, where we get to that phase is an important point because I think maybe it's more so likely. This is why I guess a podcast like this is kind of helpful for society. It might not happen next year, or it might happen in 20 years' time, but there may be a certain scenario where this idea is put forward to us and is really pushed forward, and potentially it could be implemented at a time where people's minds are in a state of shock. Maybe like the governance has just fell apart, and people are like, "Holy shit, my bank account's been frozen. I have no way of getting food, and this is really a shocking scenario to be in. I can't believe this has happened." And then these ideas are put forward while we're in a certain state of like shock, and then we're saying, well, anything could be better than the current situation that we're in right now. So then it is one world government time. So yeah, I hopefully have given you a few ideas and thoughts there. I've given probably more so a libertarian view of the one world government scheme, but if you can think, particularly just to keep the balanced views going, maybe the Rockefellers could send me a nice email or something in return. If we could idealize a really, if we could put forward counter arguments for and against, I would actually recommend that. If you could just do for and against arguments, and we get these counterbalancing views, and we use deduction to get to the means of the best future for mankind. We use deduction, we use empirical data, we use statistics, and we look at what's happened throughout history and what's happened throughout the history of time and man. Once we deduce ourselves to the best way, shape, or form that humanity can survive for its own good for the future, I would suggest it is the path of being moral as possible, and to be good and virtuous to our fellow men, rather than having a centralized governing force of power. So, please just put your viewpoints ahead towards me. I try and give a fairly balanced view from both sides of the fence. It's a little bit tricky sometimes where you do have quite an extreme perspective, which could come into place, and I guess it is quite scary at the same time. So, thank you very much for your time. I hope this is of some use to you and potentially in the future. Thanks as always, and I shall continue on with further podcasts. Thank you very much.